now we have another great innovator, and that is Andrew Powell. Andrew Powell is a psychiatrist I've known for a very long time. He's a great friend. And Andrew is absolutely right at the cutting edge of his subject. In the Maudsley Hospital, there was all the people who were materialists. They gathered in the canteen, and there were all those people who were analysts, and they gathered in the third floor of a rather not very salubrious outblock. And you used to talk to them and say, how are things? And they say, oh, my analyst says. And that really wasn't right. And then they always looked tired. And this is because they had at least 2 hours of analysis before they came into the hospital in the morning. But one of Andrew's great achievements was the bringing into psychiatry of the spiritual psychiatry special interest group. And before, it hadn't been there. And then Andrew, who's a master politician, got it through all the committees in the college. And there it was. And I remember our first meeting, and people came into the group with tears in their eyes, saying, this is what psychiatry's been about. We've never been able to talk about the real meaning for people with mental illness or in hospital. So it was an enormous achievement. So Andrew, thank you very much.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be speaking here today on the occasion of celebrating Peter and Elizabeth's 80th years. And thank you for those kind words, Peter. This isn't going to be an academic presentation. I'm going to be going down memory lane. Peter and I go back a long way, and I hope you'll bear with me when I recollect some of our adventures. Peter and I were both at Trinity College, Cambridge, and we studied natural sciences. There was no medical school in Cambridge in those days. And it happens we both went to Thomas's Hospital to do our clinical training after that. But Peter is some years my senior, and we didn't actually meet until I went to the Maudsley in 1972 to specialize in psychiatry. But if my memory serves me right, I actually knew about Elizabeth before Peter, because I used to read World Medicine. And every week, or I think it was weekly or monthly, well, we had these wonderful, entertaining and very informative contributions from Elizabeth about everything under the sun. And I used to enjoy those greatly. My first impression of Peter, when I met him at the Maudsley, was of this big, bounding man, always radiating enthusiasm and bonhomie, and his favorite word was wonderful. And something I came over the years to listen out for, because it characterizes something very special about Peter, his determination to see the best in everything and everyone. It wouldn't be wrong to say that Peter has lived his life in a state of wonderment, a state that has powered his researches in medicine and spirituality, and which, coupled with his enormous intelligence, has enabled him to make a great contribution to both fields. And more than that, in bringing these fields together, Peter has attracted the opprobrium of some very vociferous skeptics. I shan't name them today. And they have, in my view, betrayed the depth of their prejudice by the violence of their emotions. Happily, many more have welcomed Peter's capacity to think creatively outside the box, which is so rare in our culture of applied science these days. And Peter has, of course, met opposition with unfailing good humor. His natural kindness precludes any kind of retaliation, and that spares him many fruitless arguments. To return to the Maudsley, I soon realized that general psychiatry wasn't really for me. As Peter mentioned, I immersed myself in psychoanalysis, and I took up residence on the 3rd floor of outpatients. I think we psychotherapists privately regarded ourselves as top dogs, not just geographically, and such was our misplaced conceit. In fact, the Maudsley was a great powerhouse. Extraordinary research was going on and clinical activities were going on, and Peter was heading up the epilepsy unit doing real science. We psychotherapists doubted that science would ever explain the mind, and it is a view I still hold today. However, Peter and those like him who dare to think beyond the confines of material realism have been able to show through their researches that mind cannot be reduced to a function of the brain. And this is a very important thing to make clear. Exactly where mind is located has not yet been determined, and it may prove difficult, especially if it turns out to be everywhere. How does one find something that is everywhere? I'm reminded of the Buddhist saying, neti neti, not this, not this. A negation used to awaken to Atman, the immaterial and universal soul. Western science operates by looking for the lost keys under the light of the lamppost. We now know that there are other places to look and other lights to shine. And Peter's researches have helped us do this, not by disparaging science, but by understanding better what it does offer and what are its limitations. Now, Peter mentioned how he felt himself challenged by Raymond Moody's book, Life After Life, which was published in 1975. While I'd previously been working in general medicine around 1971, a patient of mine had a cardiac arrest just while I was giving him an intravenous injection. And you can imagine I was tremendously relieved when we got him back. Later in outpatients, he thanked me, gave me a bottle of whiskey and confided, "You'll probably think I'm mad. But while I was out, I left my body and started going towards this bright light." I previously read the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Evans Wentz, so I could put two and two together. But this episode stayed very vivid in my mind, and a few years later, when I'd moved to St. George's in London, I came across David Lorimer's first book, Survival, Body, Mind and Death in the Light of Psychic Experience. I don't know if you remember, David, but I wrote to you right away. And David said, "Why don't you join the network?" Which I did. At my first meeting, there was Peter, large as life, chairing a question and answer session. Now, some responses from the gathering, although clearly a product of deep thought, were abstruse to the point of being nearly incomprehensible. This is a feature of scientific and medical network meetings. Peter never turned a hair. The more obscure the contribution, the more he'd greet it with delight, saying, "That's a wonderful idea, thank you so much." Incidentally, I don't believe I've ever heard Peter say an unkind word about anyone, and that's a rare thing. And not long after this, Peter and David asked if I would stand for counsel of the network, as it was then called. And we used to meet at Peter's home in South London. And I had the pleasure of really getting to know David, always encyclopedic, Max Payne, who passed away recently, larger than life, Paul Fillmore, always courteous, Di Cliff, Di is here, isn't she? Where are you? Irrepressible, I think is the word for Di, and many other good people. Having trained as a group analyst, I like to think that I could privately help Peter negotiate some of the controversies that arose in council, and there were many. Peter always welcomed my thoughts, but thankfully he never took me too seriously. Instead, he teased me about my preoccupation with the shadow, which fascinated him, by the way, while at the same time he declared himself 100% for the light. There was a lot of banter like that. By the time I moved to Oxford in my 40s, my love affair with psychoanalysis had been superseded by a more mature inquiry, or so I like to think, into Jung and the transpersonal. Peter and the network had become a touchstone in my endeavors to bring the spiritual dimension into psychiatry. With David and the program committee of the network very kindly inviting me to contribute to a number of network conferences. And during those years, it was really important to find a language that we could use to bridge that divide between spirituality and psychiatry. And the network helped me find my way with that. And for a time, Peter and I shared the same professional dilemma as to whether to go public with our view that consciousness is transpersonal. But the network beyond the brain conferences helped me make up my mind. Now, Peter continued with real science, while I went on to train as a spiritual healer and got involved in things like past life regression, spirit release therapy, and so on. But for us both, spirit, call it what you like, has remained the prime mover, and we both have found ways of sharing our understanding of the spiritual universe. Peter, of course, has become an authority on the near-death experience and end-of-life experiences, and I put my efforts into furthering spirituality in mental health care. Now, I also want to mention Elizabeth's contribution, which some of you may not know so well. Elizabeth is a prolific author in her own right on mothers, babies, childhood, even the dreaded teens. But she joined with Peter in writing about past lives, the art of dying, the truth in the light, their book on the near-death experience. And besides that, Elizabeth is usually the only one who actually knows what Peter is doing tomorrow, next week, next month, and next year. And I don't think Peter knows very often what he's doing either. So I'd like to say that she is truly the woman behind the man, if only this did not make her sound less than equal. So thank you, Elizabeth. I'd like to relate a little bit of history that I hold with great affection. Now, Peter mentioned Mother Meera this morning, known to her devotees as the Divine Mother and regarded as an avatar. She lives in Germany and has done for many years, where she holds these darshans in which she silently gives blessings to the countless people who make their way to her door. Peter and Elizabeth invited me to join them on one such trip, and we set off in Peter's large and rather battered car. As we drove along, with me in the back, I observed that Peter and Elizabeth laughed a lot together. They were having endless fun playing some kind of Sudoku game, which Elizabeth had on her lap. I'd seen a lot of married couples in my work as a psychotherapist. Most of them were depressed. and I'd had a lot of trouble in my personal life too. And I realized the truth of the aphorism, couples who laugh together stay together. And it's something that's taken me most of my life to realize. As we advanced into Germany, it began to snow. Do you remember this? The conditions worsened hour by hour, and Peter assumed command like the captain of his ship. He demonstrated a number of times how good the ABS brakes were. In those days, they were only fitted to big cars, so he'd jam on the brakes, and we'd all feel this juddering movement, which he was sure would reassure me. By now, we were on country roads in some remote part of Germany, and we discovered the car wouldn't go uphill as the tires just spun. But Peter remained supremely confident. He got out the map and studied the terrain and declared that it was passably flat. All we had to do was to get out and push a little bit and we'd be all right. And so we did this quite a few times. Peter was gripping the steering wheel, willing the car on with every ounce of his being. And we made it to a small town just short of Mother Meera's, where we had baths and a nice meal, and went along the next day to see Mother Meera and have our dose of enlightenment. And very extraordinary it was too. But I tell the story also because it shows Peter's incurable optimism at work. It's an attribute not to be confused with naivety, but having trust in the goodness of life, that in the end all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. In 1995, I had a major health crisis and I was off work for several months. When I returned, I could see that my days in the NHS were numbered, but not hopefully my own. My views on life, death, and all that goes between, and probably before and after, were making me feel increasingly at odds with the imperatives of the mental health services, which struck me like trying to fill a bucket with holes in it. And I felt that psychiatry without spirituality could never provide the containment for the anxiety, fear, and depression which afflicts so many people these days. We have an epidemic of depression. And I was aware that there was a burgeoning body of research coming from the US, in particular the work of Harold Koenig and others, demonstrating the positive correlation between mental health and spirituality. Colleagues were confiding in me privately, their deep concerns and their spiritual longing to find a way to work in a different context. There was the whole field of spiritual emergency, that complex interface between having a spiritual awakening, sometimes accompanied by acute mental illness, not always, but sometimes, and this could be very difficult to unpack. And then the Mental Health Foundation, other bodies, were now doing surveys showing that while the majority of the public at large really wanted to have help that included their deepest spiritual values and concerns, that the psychiatrists and psychologists were just not getting it. There was a real discrepancy, a communication gap. So I thought, how could we do this in a small way? And so, as Peter mentioned, I went to the college and proposed that we start this group. I wrote around to a couple of hundred colleagues and found there was a lot of support for this. And so, although I anticipated a lot of opposition, actually we got a lot of support and we were able to start. Of the 6 colleagues in that initial steering group, 4 were friends from the network. Peter, myself, Julian Candy, and Larry Culliford. So it kind of birthed out of the network in that sense. And in 1999, we had an inaugural meeting, which nicely heralded the millennium. We've now got about 3,000 psychiatrists on our books. It doesn't mean that spiritually informed healthcare is widely available, I'm afraid. We're not a clinical service. But it does mean that there are a lot of psychiatrists, as I'd always thought, who'd gone into the profession really wishing to work in a very different way, but who've been forced, cornered into a kind of boxed into working in a way that doesn't allow them to do what they really wanted to do. In those early days of the group, Peter's enthusiasm was infectious. And the first time that we were given a lecture slot at the Royal College's annual Congress, so this is sort of high-profile moment, we asked Peter to talk on near-death experiences, which got us off to a flying start. Now, this brings me to how Peter and I got to Edinburgh in Peter's little-owned single-engined Robin plane. We met early in the morning at Oxford Airport. Peter in his element carrying an enormous case full of maps of airports and flight corridors and goodness knows what. We walked out onto the airfield and there was this diminutive, not very new little plane with a wingspan of about 15 feet. I began to wonder if we should be going to Edinburgh in this aircraft. But Peter checked the fuel and he fiddled about, sort of banging things on the outside of the plane, and he declared it fit to fly. So we spent the first half hour going round and round in circles. Why? Because the little plane was hauling us up to 10,000 feet. Peter is instrument rated, meaning he can fly in clouds at night and avail himself of air traffic control, just like a jumbo jet. And nothing less would do for Peter. So up we went. And he delighted in the whole rigmarole of being directed by air traffic control at Heathrow, then Manchester, then Scotland, as we wended our way through a wonderful cloudscape of cumulus. Eventually we found Edinburgh and came down much more quickly. We peered out of the window and then we could see the airport, this mile-long runway. It looked deserted. I said to Peter, there's no planes on this airport. He said, no, they've stopped all the airplanes because we're coming in. So this little plane, you know, landed in the first 100 yards of this very long runway, and then we taxied for about a quarter of an hour down to the end. And of course, the airport couldn't reopen until we'd come off the runway, which shows that size isn't everything. Peter leapt out of the plane as fresh as a daisy. I felt exhausted. I asked him, did Elizabeth fly very often with him? And he said, well, she's not that keen on flying. Yesterday, I asked Elizabeth, is this true? And she said, well, it used to be all right, but then we were flying somewhere and we had to come down by a river, and it was quite difficult to get to the runway. And just as we got in sight of the runway, the fuel ran out on one tank. So Peter had to switch the fuel to the other side, which is a sort of lever. And as he was switching it over, the knob came off in his hand. So he said to Elizabeth, who doesn't fly, you hold the controls. There's a toolbox in the back. I'll go and get the screwdriver. They did land, but I think you said you were shaking when you got out. But I don't think Peter really could see what you were so nervous about.
And then I burst into tears and I said, I'm never, ever going up in that thing, ever again.
Well, this lovely memory does tell me something about Peter's disposition. He is fearless. Some people are fearless because they don't have any imagination, but Peter's fearless because he's got imagination in spades. No subject is off limits. His curiosity about life, people, the physical and the spiritual universe, it's all up for discussion and it's all up for research. So to say a little bit more about spirituality and psychiatry, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail because I felt today is like an homage to these dear people who mean so much to so many of us. But I will say a little bit more. And if you want to know about our work in the Royal College, just Google spirituality psychiatry. We come straight on screen. And go in and have a look at our website. If you go to the Publications Archive, there are about 100 papers or more written by psychiatrists who are really deeply interested in spirituality, and some of those are lovely papers. If you want to know about psychiatry in this country, you might like to look at a paper of mine in the archive called Furthering the Spiritual Dimension of Psychiatry in the UK. Now, the context of all of this is that psychiatry is based on a medical model of brain pathology that began in the 19th century when it was realized that certain organic diseases like brain tumors, porphyria, vitamin deficiencies, syphilis and so on, cause mental symptoms. And this assumption, which has led to classifying mental illness in just the same way as other medical pathology, has resulted to date in no less than 297 mental disorders being listed in DSM-4, one of the diagnostic manuals used. And the ICD-10, the other diagnostic manual that's developed by WHO, isn't far behind. And you might well ask, is there really such a thing as normality anymore? Much of this classification has been dreamed up in committee, pulling together clusters of symptoms, hoping to create a comprehensive lingua franca that will advance the mental health sciences. But it doesn't tell us anything much about etiology or prognosis. It's good for ticking boxes and generating statistics. And the prevailing view is that most mental illness is caused by neurochemical imbalances arising from a range of causes: genetic, nutritional, hormonal, environmental, stress-related, drug-induced, and so on. The word for it is multifactorial. And when, as often happens, there's more than one diagnosis, surprise, surprise, with such a system, we talk about comorbidity, which sounds very grand. A unifying neurochemical hypothesis remains entirely unproven, but it's attracted a lot of support, especially from the pharmaceutical industry. The more conditions there are, the more profit there is to be made, not least when young people are put on medication in the long term. And if this fires you up, read a book by James Davies called Cracked, Why Psychiatry is Doing More Harm Than Good. He talked at one of the network meetings recently at Claudia's London group, and I was very interested to have a conversation with him. He's a clinical psychologist. This is not to say that real science can't help. PET and fMRI scanning of the brain structure and function, these are very valuable research tools, and Peter knows an awful lot about them. But there's a danger here, too, that the findings of neuroscience will be taken to validate a reductionist approach to mental disorder. In the same way, we've been hearing about that this morning, well, from Max and from Rupert and others, in the same way that correlation can be mistaken for causation when studying consciousness. The fact is that the two major mental disorders, schizophrenia and bipolar illness, remain largely a mystery, and treatment is symptomatic. The medication often produces side effects which can be serious. I'm not saying that medication isn't sometimes needed, but let's be clear what's going on. And the approach is often one of trial and error, weighing up the benefits against the risk of harm. Beyond the psychosis, there's an enormous catch-all of alarming proportions. The whole field of personality disorder, abuse, trauma, deviant behavior, and of course the neuroses. That isn't a word that's often used now, but that encompasses a continuum of suicide at one end to just deep unhappiness at the other. So what's really going on? When I began, psychoanalysis and its derivative therapies still held the promise of great things, but it hasn't delivered the goods. It doesn't work for major mental illness, and for the rest, it's very expensive, it takes too long, and the outcome is very uncertain. And most of all, Freud's explicit atheism has left the soul outside the door. Short-term therapies have been largely taken over by clinical psychology. Behavioral treatments have been successful to a point, but the subjective self remains untouched, which is hardly surprising because the tail can't wag the dog. There's been more success with cognitive approaches as long as the problem is secular and focused. Recently, mindfulness therapy has been introduced with an evidence base, and this is a really good thing. But I think the reason it's got in under the radar is that it's not presented as a spiritual therapy, but as a secular therapy. I don't know if this is luck or judgment, but anyway, that's how it's packaged, and it is becoming more available. But what about human spirituality? What's happening to the soul of humankind? Life, by its very nature, is a challenge to every person born on this planet. We're all put through the ringer at some time in our lives, and hence the saying, God never promised you a smooth crossing, only a safe landing. The instinct of the ego, when faced with adversity, is to fight back, and this can be a good thing. But the ego suffers from conceit, is not gifted with a lot of insight, and likes blaming others when things go wrong. So in my view, finding our way through adversity needs the guidance and wisdom of the soul, which can see the bigger picture, how the trials and tribulations of life help us become more compassionate and find a deeper meaning and purpose to our existence here. Not just individually, but collectively. And one simple but profound description of spirituality I came across the other day. You can imagine there are endless definitions, but I like this very much. Spirituality is the realization that I belong to more than myself. Unfortunately, we're now living in a world that denies the soul and instead feeds us rubbish, which makes a lot of people ill. And I've written about this recently in a paper called Modernity and the Beleaguered Soul. That's on the website if you want to have a look. And so often the treatment lies not in taking the tablet, but in being helped fundamentally to reappraise what life is for. And this is work of the soul. It calls for loving human connectedness at a deep level. That's not often found in our current mental health care. Now, what is life? Listening to the talks this morning, I was tempted to sort of begin with this, and it's a wonderful topic, but of course it's without end. I mean, are we living in a virtual reality, enfolded by other virtual realities? Is this a waking dream? Are there a multiplicity of dimensions? Our chair of the network, Bernard Carr, who's an eminent cosmologist, will tell you more about that. Wonderful questions to ask. But to come back to Earth on this one, what is this life for? We are here, and we've got to live it and make what we can of it. Now, there's no ready prescription because we all arrive with our unique agendas. Those of us who've had more than one child know that our children come out of the womb marked with their own extraordinary, unique qualities. Spiritually informed therapy seeks to help each person answer this question for themselves. There are many roads that can be taken. In a paper I wrote called Soul-Centered Psychotherapy, if you want to look at that on the website, I identify a number of specific approaches. Incidentally, you don't need a medium to talk to the deceased. If someone comes along and is bereaved and is burdened with something that was unsaid or unexpressed to the one who's passed on, you can ask them to close their eyes, bring that person to them, say what they need to say to that person, and then listen for the answer. And 9 times out of 10, they'll get an answer. They'll say, oh, my mother said, don't worry, it's all right, or whatever it may be. You can finish that work right in the here and now. If you want to go to a medium too, fine. But you can do it in the consulting room. That's very different from talking about someone who's died. It's letting the experience be alive and in the room with you. But whatever the specific approach, what's really important and common to all spiritually informed therapy is that the compassionate therapist accompanies the patient on the way, offers encouragement, occasionally gives advice, but never claims to know another person's truth. And as they journey together, something extraordinary happens. When souls commune, the heart opens, for the soul has its own joy in being. It's our spiritual birthright, and we are born to love, as almost every survivor of an NDE is so much wanting us to understand. Ironically, discovering that truth for ourselves can take a lifetime. We have to take it on trust that all the vagaries of life that seemingly stand in the way are there for good reason. It can be hard work clearing a path, and sometimes we do need help. Spiritual psychiatry never discounts the importance and preciousness of everyday life, family, friends, relationship, work, and the magnificence of the natural world in which we live. But here's a thought. It's been said that all psychiatry is really child psychiatry. That to find someone means to find the child within them. I'll go further and propose that when we take the word psyche to heart, the best practice in psychiatry should mean, as the name suggests, reaching out not only to the child, but to the soul. In the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and this is beautiful, we see the world piece by piece as the sun, the moon, the animal, the tree, but the whole of which these are shining parts is the soul. It's another way of saying, I belong to more than myself. Those are words befitting this gathering today in honor of our dear friends Peter and Elizabeth. Thank you.
Wow, what a wonderful talk. Thank you so much. And it makes me realize that we've been so lucky, I have been so lucky, to have worked with astonishing people. And Andrew, and Max, and Rupert, and David are all people like that. And I'd like you all, please, to show your appreciation of Andrew's achievements in psychiatry. It really is something. It was mechanistic model, nothing else. And now it's mechanistic model in the whole person. So thank you very much.